being acutely aware of sort of who gets to build and who gets to decide how to distribute technologies as well is an important factor in the sort of entire sort of supply chain of how you distribute your tech products and services, essentially.
Tech Ethics 101 and Planning for Unintended Uses of Your Technology. We're looking at when you need to think about these kind of problems. What kind of code of ethics should you be following? What resources are there out there to make sure that you're on the right side of the law? Also looking at what do investors look at in this situation? In the world of AI, how can you make sure you're on the right side of history? And so much more. To help us answer these questions, we have Dama Sathianathan, who is a senior partner at Bethnal Green Ventures. They're one of Europe's leading tech for good venture capital funds, and they look at companies at the early stage to really accelerate those companies really making a difference. She's also a massive thought leader within this industry and is part of many different groups, such as Venture ESG, to make sure tech is working for us rather than against us. I'm Mama from the Bay HQ, and this podcast is powered by HSBC Innovation Banking. So, really important topic today, all about the ethics around technology. And I think it's something which people often get really excited about what they're doing, and maybe they just think about this a bit too late. So from your experience, when should founders start thinking about what are the effects of their technology and the unintended consequences?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because across sort of the early stage spectrum, you have very different opinions on when might be the most opportune time for founders to actually think about this. But as sort of very early stage investors in the space, we think it's a conversation that people should have within their teams from the get-go, even from the inception of their businesses, essentially because the way you think about responsible product design in essence already starts with the people who are actually developing the tech products and services, or who are also thinking about how it might be used by the people that they're trying to serve. Because ultimately, and this is to quote Shion Bura on this, if it's not diverse by design, it will be unequal by outcome. So the simple answer to what we would usually say in this is it really helps to sort of start building the sort of muscle memory to think about addressing some of those significant risks that could occur as companies scale from literally day one.
What are some good things to be thinking about here? So what types of ethical codes or like concerns that people might not realize that they should be thinking about? So what areas should they be looking into here?
This is a topic that I love to talk about, and it's actually something that we do as part of our program as well, which is a sort of session around sort of impact risk and the unintended consequences. And we take it a bit back to sort of the ethics and the philosophy behind technologies as well. And the first sort of principle that we usually come back to is by a chap called Melvin Kranzberg, who wrote up the Rules of Technology. And one of the most pivotal ones that really accentuates why this is important is all about focusing that technology is neither good and nor bad, and it's definitely not neutral. And it basically relates to the sort of fallacy, but technology is just a tool. But technology is actually neither produced or used in a social vacuum, and it's therefore also no less neutral than the people or society that actually produce and use it. So actually being acutely aware of sort of who gets to build and who gets to decide how to distribute technologies as well is an important factor in the sort of entire sort of supply chain of how you distribute your tech products and services, essentially. And if we look at sort of tech ethics and codes, we used to bring up quite a lot of tech ethics and principles through the Tech for Good community. So there's quite a large proportion, I think 10 principles or so that we've also published on our website many years ago, that sort of look into all the different aspects, from the sort of provenance of technologies and how you might think about it, to even how you increase the diversity of the people who actually get to develop those technologies as well. And what do you even do when you work with very marginalized and underserved communities to sort of ensure that there's no trade-off for them to be able to use X over Y. Because there have been loads and loads of case studies where very novel, innovative technology that is largely untested and could be quite harmful has been imposed onto refugees, for example, because they were literally in a position where they had no other avenue than the support that was already provided. So facial recognition, biometrics in humanitarian and disaster responses, for example, had a huge impact on and adverse effects on those people as well. So I think, yeah, when it comes to other sort of ethics codes, the sort of principles behind technology are a good shout. There's a friend of mine who teaches at one of the UK universities around sort of tech ethics as well, and he wrote a really good blog on around sort of 10 particular technology rules as well. So that could sort of serve as a guiding principle or as a starting point, which includes the sort of the readings and more research from social technologists like Kentaro Toyama, who wrote that technology can only amplify existing capacity intent back in 1980, and much more. So highly recommend, and we'll make sure that you can include this in the notes as well.
So you mentioned a few really interesting things there, and you mentioned about who builds it and the effect that has, but also how your product might affect different communities. And let's say somebody's quite early stage and they're thinking about, okay, they want to build something, they're trying to build out their MVP or they just passed their MVP, and they're trying to build how do they try to do that in practice in terms of making sure that they don't have unintended consequences? Is it something that you do in phases, or what kind of element of testing or processes can help people in this moment at the time?
Yeah, so what we use, for example, is an open source tool that's licensed under Creative Commons, so anyone can use it. It's not just bespoke to B2B, which is great. But we use it with companies at pre-product, pre-revenue stage, so it's very early and can be adapted throughout the life cycle of a company as well. But essentially, it's the unintended consequence scanning workshop that was developed by Everyone, and it lives on the sort of Tech Transformed website from the Ada Lovelace Institute. But that's essentially just a blueprint for how you think about to actually understand what are intended and unintended consequences, and it gives you sort of conversation prompts to actually bring in your entire team to have these conversations around what do we actually want to do with a particular product feature or a particular product development cycle. And that's sort of the way you can also integrate it into your product development cycle time and time again as you grow and scale and get to sort of maturity as of a Series A company or beyond. That this is sort of an iterative process whenever you want to think about whenever you need the sort of assurance that you have actually mitigated any potential harms as well. And the unintended consequence scanning workshop, whenever we do this with our founders, quite often they're usually faced with, oh my God, there's like so many things I have not thought about, from like the environmental impact of actually thinking about, do I really need to build this technology because it's using so much water and energy to actually just run a large language model, to people understanding that the potential external risk for someone misusing their wearable technology for surveillance would have been something that they would have never considered if it wasn't for that workshop. So it's a sort of good starting point to actually think about these conversations and anticipate what future risk might occur, and actively sort of think about the strategies that you can bring in to sort of mitigate those. That's not to say that every single unintended consequence, if someone is building a social media network and that it could potentially bring about the demise of a democratic society, is not necessarily something that anyone can spot on day one. But because there are so many examples of tech being used for bad, for nefarious or malicious purposes, or for unintended bad purposes as well, because the consequence has just been that people didn't anticipate those risks, that just really highlights that we do have a responsibility to really think about where our own sort of ownership and agency lies in actually mitigating those risks as well. There's so many examples that we've gathered from tech companies where technology has caused significant harm to people, but doing this exercise actually helps people to think about, so now that I'm aware, what sort of guardrails can I put in place that just ensures that these harms won't happen? And in turn, just increases the sort of trust between their potential users and between the different stakeholders as part of their journey, that this is a good product to use.
One of the examples that comes to mind as you were saying that as well is the Apple AirTags, where obviously the idea is like, oh, so you don't lose something, but it also can be used to stalk somebody, and there's all these other things that obviously you don't want it to be used for. But it's like, how do you control that as well? And like you said, it's if you just put the technology out there, once it's out there, then it can be used for these bad reasons, right? So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying about the earlier you can think about it, then it's before Pandora's box is opened, right?
Yeah,
And even when it comes to, for example, the accessibility aspects, is so from a tech background, is that a lot of people implement on their websites is about the alt text, for example, to make sure that if people who are sight impaired can be able to hear what an image is, for example, and the contrast between colors. I think that's another one that a lot of people just forget, that if you have very good eyesight, you might not realize actually a lot of people can't really read what's on your page. And also that can be a really frustrating experience. So that kind of element too is something which it's quite difficult for sometimes people, because there's, especially entrepreneurs, they're so wrapped up in what they're doing, but all of these different things about the unintended consequences, you just don't want to put something out there which then causes harm that you didn't intend, obviously. And one of the things that, from your perspective as an investor, is that when you're looking to invest in these kind of companies, or somebody's trying to attract ESG funding, how can somebody think about these consequences as well? Because I guess even when they're trying to apply for funding from you or to join your accelerator, you're going to be assessing them based on this too, right? Of, are they a company which is fulfilling or doing something for good? So if you're at the earlier stage and trying to think, okay, I want funding from Bethnal Green, or I want funding from somewhere else, how do I prove to them that what I'm doing is more good than bad?
Yeah, that's always quite hard to prove at the early stages, right? Because it feels like it's more art than a science, especially when people are just about deploying their MVPs and prototypes. But I think for us, it's mostly a combination, and I guess that's the case for more impact investors in the space as well. It's really behind assessing people's intention to wanting to do this as well, because and that's a slight sort of conundrum as well, because we do also say just by virtue of doing good doesn't mean that you are good, which then sort of extends to the ESG lens of this. So how do you actually think about operating responsibly as well? And that sort of goes beyond your tech product or service. And that goes into your governance structure as a company, the way you treat your employees, the way you interact with different stakeholders, and think about your wider impact on people and planet. That goes beyond the sort of the outcomes that you might want to achieve with your product. And there's a few sort of ESG VC groups knocking about. I'm involved with Venture ESG, for example, who have really great sort of tools available for VCs and LPs to actually do a lot more DD and help them assess sort of the maturity of companies when it comes to asking those sort of hard fundamental questions on how you operate as a company. In terms of what founders can do, I think there's fundamentally a few sort of areas that always make sense to sort of prep for, and also include in data rooms, for example, which is basically like if you've done a consequence scanning workshop at the very earliest stages, for example, because it's very easy to run them within your own company, because the workshop guidelines actually give you a sort of facilitation guide on how you might run this workshop yourself. So it's definitely worthwhile checking out. But it basically also provides you with a few tools where you can just try to track what types of consequences, for example, you've listed, and what type of strategies you might be able to deploy, because ultimately you can't address everything, because there might be a whole universe of issues that you need to tackle, and there's only so much a founder can do. But as long as you have the awareness, and as long as you can showcase to us that you have gone through like a prioritization matrix and actually identified these are quite high risk, high impact consequences that we absolutely need to mitigate, then that's enough sort of assurance for us to make an investment into you. And also enough assurance for us that you are not only thinking about this, but you're also incredibly receptive to feedback and incredibly humble about the shortcomings of the things that you might be building, but super eager to tackle those as well, which is exactly the right pathway for founders. because I do fundamentally believe that intent is incredibly important, but it isn't enough. So being able to tap into resources and founders, tapping into investors who can provide you with a lot of value and actually helping you support you on this journey is an incredibly smart feat of founders as well.
We hope you're enjoying the episode so far. We just want to give a quick shout out to our headline partners, HSBC Innovation Banking. One of the biggest challenges for so many startups is finding the right bank to support them. Because you might start off and try to use a traditional bank, but they don't understand what you're doing. You're just talking to an AI assistant, or you're talking to somebody who doesn't really understand what it is you're even trying to do. HSBC have got the team they've built out over years to make sure they understand what you're doing. They've got the deep sector expertise, and they can help connect you with the right people to make your dreams come true. So if you want to learn more, check out hbcinnovationbanking.com.
Obviously, what's happened in the last year or two is that things seem to have got a lot more complicated with the addition of AI. And you've been in the space for a significant amount of time. You've looked at so many different companies. And how has that adjustment been from an investor perspective of now trying to work out this not new technology, but it seems to have moved very quickly. And obviously regulators are trying to keep up to date, founders are trying to keep up to date, investors are trying to keep up to date. How should people be listening right now thinking about responsible AI?
Yeah. So for the investors, there's quite a few sort of resources that are available, which a lot of sort of collectives have now worked on as well. So the responsible AI labs, for example, which have sort of a protocol and a framework with sort of a few sort of guardrails and guidance around what you might do in order to assess companies effectively, and what sort of questions you might be asking your companies in order to diligence the sort of responsibility approach in that aspect as well. And for founders on the flip side, there's also a few sort of resources available from them and from the likes of Startups in Society, which is a US-based organization. They're really, really great and have put together sort of guidance on this as well for people to think about, okay, so what are actually Google also, who published a People and AI guidebook, which is, it's quite funny to say that Google has published this, but they have. So the People and AI guidebook is a really great resource for founders, for example, who just want to try to even explore whether AI is actually needed, or what the sort of differences could be between sort of actually automating a process versus deploying generative AI in order to build something new. And it's quite an interesting sort of founder resource, to be honest, because it does give you quite practical applications of how you might think about the different processes that actually require you to really question, do I really need to build this, or is this just a nice to have? And I think generally when it comes to AI, the way we've sort of thought about asking questions and diligencing companies. So to give you a very practical example, we get a lot of companies who basically say, oh, we're building this new algorithm who can do X, Y, Z across sort of health tech, across sustainability and climate, across different domains. And we're kind of like, the fundamental question is always, so where does your training data come from? Because ultimately, technology is not neutral. So who are the people who are feeding the data into this? Where is this data coming from? Particularly when it's health tech companies as well, and they sort of have aspiration of saying, oh, we want to increase the sort of better health outcomes for people from ethnic minority backgrounds. Great. Ethnic minority backgrounds, data about people from specific backgrounds has always notoriously been hard to get by. So how do you plan on developing this if it's targeted a particular segment of the population that has notoriously been left behind? So these type of questions usually, and if people can answer those questions, even if it's to sort of say these are sort of aspects that we're thinking about, we don't have the answers to them yet, but we're doing this by, for example, engaging particular communities in our user research, actually building a panel around guiding the sort of questions that we need to tackle when it comes to actually feeding more data into this, or, also paying people for a lot of the user research that they are putting into this as well, particularly if it's traditionally marginalized communities. Those are sort of the types of answers that give us enough assurance as to they've got they've got the brains and the heart in the right place, to actually tackling these issues head on and are thinking about this. And hopefully we'll be able to help them and steer them in the right direction as to how they might consider more work in this space, that they actually build tech products and services that can work and are adopted by the people that they're trying to serve. Sorry, long-winded answer to this.
No, it's really interesting. So I was just thinking about if, I think you've answered some of what I was going to ask next, where about if founders are now think about themselves, where ethics are changing as well, because I guess that's one of the interesting things too, is that what the ethical code was, say, 10 years ago and what the ethical standards were probably a lot less than what we consider today to be the correct standard. And how can founders keep up with that? Because obviously in 10 years time, people might look at what we're saying right now and be like, oh, they're so backward, because standards keep adjusting and changing all the time. How can founders try to keep up with that? How can they keep up with that adjustment in what's the latest way to make sure that you're being intentional in helping people in the right way?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I feel like, a very fundamental question, but also incredibly subjective, right? But because there's an answer to even what do we even mean by tech for good, and how can we be incredibly prescriptive as to what outcomes are the best for whom, right? But I do think the sort of easy answer to this is basically taking a human rights-based approach. So really taking the lens of do no harm, and that extends to absolutely everyone. Always using that as sort of the moral compass as to what guides your actions, to basically just enforce that you do no harm with what you're building. And that's not to say that something might occur that you wouldn't have noticed. We are human after all, and we all make mistakes. But essentially, if we take the sort of moral compass of doing no harm to people and planet is sort of the baseline for us, then I think we'll be all right.
And obviously, you're involved in so many different initiatives in this tech for good space. What are you excited about at the moment? What do you think is coming out, say, in the next few years, or in the next maybe even sooner than that, that is really exciting in the space that kind of keeps you motivated and keeps you excited about what you're doing?
Oh, that's a good question. What keeps me motivated? I think the easy answer is always that what keeps me motivated is that there are so many issues that just need tackling, and there are so many issues that affect so many different people with so many different lived experiences that are very different to where I come from. And I'm very excited about the potential of people from all walks of life being able to just be young, scrappy, and hungry, essentially, and build something that could help make the world a better place, to be honest. I'm always quite fascinated. Like in my job, I get to speak to so many founders on a regular basis about their ideas, about what they're trying to build as well. And it's a very novel sort of situation to always be surrounded by founders who are trying to build something for good. Sometimes there are a few sort of wacko ideas where you're literally like, I mean, I'm sorry, this is surveillance technology that you're thinking about right now, even though you maybe want to, reduce the sort of divorce rates in a particular country. You can't just build a wearable ring that tracks where your partner is going for all the right reasons or whatever. But on the flip side, you also have very significant, amazing ideas of where you might, as an individual, feel quite jaded about the state of the world, but then come across so many inspiring people just trying to do something about this as well. And I think in the next couple of years in particular, I feel like this year, particularly with sort of elections, there's so many, it's one of the biggest election years in the world, with so many people in so many countries, more than 30 countries, being able to vote for the first time even, which is hugely fascinating. But technology of the past years has also just increased the level of disinformation and misinformation. So what I'm quite excited about is actually seeing the sort of proliferation of companies actually doing something about enabling people to learn and inform each other better, and to actually make more conscious decisions about how we consume different types of media as well. So even sort of, for example, I've seen loads and loads of amazing stuff being built in civil society sector around tackling misinformation and disinformation, but I haven't seen much yet in terms of actually for-profit companies trying to do this as well, or trying to do this at scale, because it is a relatively nascent field. But I would love to see sort of more collaboration across different sectors in this domain, and actually see more of this being done that truly helps us build a better society.
So thanks so much for all of the insights you gave there. We're going to move on to quick fire questions now.
Oh.
So first question is, who are 3 British Asians you think are doing incredible work and you'd love to shout them out?
Okay, I'll shout out Shruti, who works at a climate fund. She's an amazing climate tech investor. I will shout out Drishti, who is the founder of TechSpert AI. I mean, one of our portfolio companies. But she's an amazing human being and is trying to do something about a very crucial problem in the space. And Nina Mohanty, founder of Blue Money. Just because I also ran into her 2 days ago, so she's top of my mind at the moment.
Awesome. And then if people want to find out more about you, find out more about Bethnal Green Ventures, where can they go to?
If they want to find out more about Bethnal Green Ventures, they can go to bethnalgreenventures.com. If they want to apply for funding, because we're open for applications at the moment, they can go to /apply, and can get in touch anytime with us to either learn more about B2B in a Q&A session, or talk to anyone in the B2B team for 20 minutes about the idea. If people want to find out more about me, I hate LinkedIn, but LinkedIn is probably the best shot. I am the only Dama who works at Bethnal Green Ventures, and I will aim to get back to people on LinkedIn, but as I said, I really, really hate LinkedIn. So if people do get in touch, I would highly encourage them to also just add a note to say why, because it helps to sort of just filter through the noise.
Awesome. And then is there anything that you need help with right now, or Bethnal Green Ventures needs help with, that the audience could help you with?
I mean, we would love to have more tech for good founders from all walks of life apply. If that's you want support and loads of capital, please do get in touch. But generally, I feel we're always quite keen to sort of connect with people in the ecosystem who, even if you're not building a tech for good product yourself, but can help the founders in our community, or can help anyone who is thinking about making a jump to the tech for good sector as well, do just get in touch, join our meetup community as well. We're on meetup.com/tech for good. Get involved and join some of the events that we run as well.
Amazing. So thanks so much for coming on today. Have you got any final words?
I mean, if we've got heaps of resources available around sort of responsible product design as well, which we'll publish in the next coming weeks. So happy to sort of share a link to all of those resources. But if anyone also just needs help and support with actually running an unintended consequence scanning workshop for founders, very happy to do this, because I think more people should be able to just build that sort of memory muscle to anticipate future risks as well. So I'm very happy to put my time forward for that.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.